Ambushed after work. Detroit police looking for a local nurse kidnapped after leaving her hospital shift. Detectives scouring the city for this man. He's the suspect believed to have forcefully kidnapped a woman early this morning. Detroit police hoping for the woman's safe return soon.
He had been watching her, not casually, not the way someone glances at a person they used to love and feels the familiar pull of old emotion. He had been watching her the way a predator watches, with patience, with calculation, with the specific kind of focus that doesn't waver and doesn't quit and doesn't take no for an answer, no matter how many times that answer is given. He knew her schedule. He knew when her shift ended. He knew which parking lot she walked to, which car she got into, which direction she faced when she opened the door, and dropped her bag onto the seat after a long night of keeping other people alive. He knew all of it. And on the morning of May 13th, 2023, the morning before Mother's Day, he used every piece of that knowledge to make sure Patrice Wilson never made it home. But here is the detail that stops people cold. The detail that, when investigators pieced it together, made seasoned detectives pause. He didn't just show up. He didn't walk into that parking lot looking like himself. He came in disguise, a blonde wig, a hat, glasses. Standing outside Detroit Receiving Hospital in the early morning, watching the doors, waiting for a 29-year-old nurse who had spent her night caring for strangers to walk into a trap that had been set for her weeks, possibly months, in advance. That is where this story begins. But to understand the full weight of what happened outside that hospital on Mother's Day weekend, you have to go back further. Back to a relationship that everyone around Patrice Wilson could see was dangerous. Back to a man who had a criminal history long enough to fill a file cabinet. And back, much further back, to a woman named Bianca Green, a 24-year-old pregnant nursing student who disappeared in 2011 and has never been found. Because Jamere Miller was her ex-boyfriend, too. Welcome to Behind the Evidence. This channel exists to go beyond the headline into the psychology, the patterns, the warning signs that were visible before the worst happened, and the truth that doesn't always make the evening news. If you're new here, subscribe right now. We cover cases like this every week, and this one in particular is unlike almost anything we have covered before. Now let's go back to where this really started. Patrice Wilson was 29 years old. She was a nurse at Detroit Receiving Hospital, part of the Detroit Medical Center, one of the busiest trauma hospitals in the state of Michigan. She was a mother. She was a daughter, a niece, a sister, a cousin, a granddaughter. She was described by the people who worked alongside her as legendary, a word that gets used loosely until you hear the context around it. A coworker who started a fundraiser in her memory wrote that Patrice was driven and dedicated as a nurse, as a friend, and as a mother. Another nurse at Detroit Receiving, speaking anonymously to local reporters, put it simply: she was sweet. She did her job. She went home to her kid and her family. She had a 7-year-old son. She had a career she had built through discipline and commitment. And she had made a decision, a clear, deliberate, fully communicated decision to end her relationship with Jamere Miller. She had not simply grown distant. She had not gone quiet and hoped he would take the hint. She had said it plainly, and when plainly was not enough, she had started returning his gestures. The flowers he sent to her door, she left them on the doorstep, untouched. A clear, visible signal to anyone paying attention that she was not accepting what he was offering. She had tried to make it impossible to misunderstand. She was not interested. She was not coming back. She was moving forward. Jamere Miller did not accept that. Miller was 36 years old, from Inkster, a city west of Detroit in Wayne County. His criminal history was not a matter of speculation or family rumor. It was on paper. It was in the system. Drug charges, weapons charges, assault, drunk driving, eluding police. Wayne County Prosecutor Kim Worthy would later describe it plainly. A man with a significant criminal history, a documented pattern of behavior that included violence, and the disregard for boundaries that tends to escalate when those boundaries are held firmly by someone he feels entitled to access. The relationship between Miller and Wilson had produced children together, which meant that even after a breakup, even after every returned flower and every unanswered message, complete separation was complicated. Co-parenting relationships are one of the most documented danger zones in intimate partner violence research, precisely because they require ongoing contact. They require a level of continued communication that can be weaponized by an abusive partner. Every exchange becomes an opportunity for pressure. Every interaction around the children becomes a lever. The victim cannot simply go no contact, cannot simply disappear into a new life without any overlap, because there are children whose needs transcend the danger of the relationship. Patrice Wilson was navigating that impossible terrain, trying to leave a man who would not be left, while still being connected to him through the children they shared. Prosecutor Worthy said it in the press conference after Miller was charged, and the words are worth sitting with. She said the most dangerous time in any domestic violence case is when a woman is trying to leave the relationship, that it is absolutely the most dangerous, most heinous time. She said Patrice Wilson was simply trying to live her life, work hard, and break off a relationship she knew was not good for her. And she said that Miller would not leave her alone, would not respond to her wishes, would not accept the answer she had given him clearly and repeatedly, and at cost to herself, because holding that line against someone like Jamere Miller is not a passive act. It takes sustained courage. It takes the willingness to endure pressure and harassment and the creeping fear that comes with knowing the person applying that pressure has a history of violence and access to weapons, and has shown, repeatedly, that the word no does not land the way it should. Patrice Wilson held that line, and he punished her for it in the most permanent way possible. Let's go back to the morning of May 13, 2023, because the sequence of events matters enormously in understanding not just what happened, but the level of planning that preceded it. Patrice Wilson finished her shift at Detroit Receiving Hospital in the early morning hours. It was a Saturday. The following day would be Mother's Day. She had made it through another night, the kind of night that hospital nurses navigate with a combination of skill, endurance, and the quiet professional dignity that doesn't get enough credit in the public conversation about what healthcare workers actually do. She gathered her things. She walked to the parking lot. She approached her car. Jamere Miller was already there. He had not arrived when she was leaving. He had not followed her from her home or tracked her car that morning. He had come early. He had positioned himself, and he had done so in a blonde wig, a hat, and glasses, a disguise that was not casual or improvised but assembled with the specific purpose of making himself unrecognizable to security cameras, to bystanders, and possibly to Patrice herself in those first critical seconds when recognition might have given her time to react. That disguise is one of the most psychologically significant details in this entire case, and it deserves to be treated as such, because a disguise requires planning. It requires a trip to a store, a selection, and a decision about what will and won't be recognized. It requires the perpetrator to think through the scenario in advance, to visualize arriving, to consider what could go wrong, to prepare for the encounter. A disguise is premeditation made material. It is intent, dressed up and wearing a blonde wig. He went to the back passenger side of her car. He fired a handgun multiple times. Patrice Wilson was fatally wounded, and then Jamere Miller got into the driver's seat of her car and drove away. He left the hospital parking lot in her car, with her body, on the morning before Mother's Day. Detroit police were alerted to the kidnapping at approximately 7:40 a.m. The call that came in described a woman being abducted from the parking area outside Detroit Receiving Hospital, in broad morning light, in a location where people move in and out continuously. And yet the disguise had worked well enough. The chaos of the scene, the speed of the encounter, the fact that a man in a blonde wig and glasses does not immediately register as a man to witnesses processing a terrifying situation in real time. All of it bought Miller the seconds he needed to get out of that parking lot and into the Detroit street network. What followed was a manhunt that consumed the city. Detroit police launched an urgent, full-scale search for Miller and for Patrice Wilson, because at that stage, investigators did not yet know whether she was alive. Every hour of that search was an hour in which the possibility existed, however remote it may have already been, that she could be found and saved. That hope is its own particular cruelty in cases like this one, because it means that the people who loved her spent hours in the specific agony of not knowing, hours in which they were told to hope, while the evidence was moving steadily toward the worst possible conclusion. At 2:19 p.m. that afternoon, police received word that Wilson's car had been located in Novi, a suburb approximately 30 miles from Detroit Receiving Hospital. Officers responded. They found the vehicle, and they found Patrice Wilson in the rear of the car. She had been shot multiple times. She was gone. It was Mother's Day weekend. Her 7-year-old son was at home. The investigation that followed moved quickly, in part because Miller was not unknown to law enforcement and in part. After all, the evidence trail he left across Inkster, Garden City, and Novi was traceable. Detectives worked the case with the urgency it demanded, and within 2 days they had enough to name Miller publicly as their suspect. He turned himself in on May 14, 2023, not because he had experienced a crisis of conscience, not because the weight of what he had done had become unbearable. He turned himself in, according to Detroit Police Chief James White, because he was feeling the pressure of the investigation. That phrase, feeling the pressure, is worth examining. It tells you something specific about the psychology of this man in the hours after Patrice Wilson's death. He was not consumed by remorse. He was monitoring the investigation. He was tracking how close it was getting. He was calculating the moment at which surrender became more strategically viable than continued flight. That is not the behavior of someone overwhelmed by what they have done. That is the behavior of someone who is still, even in the aftermath of murder, operating from a framework of self-interest and tactical thinking. He walked into Detroit police custody 2 days after killing Patrice Wilson, and the city began to process what had happened to a woman who had done everything she was supposed to do, who had left, who had refused the flowers, who had held the line and still had not been safe. Wayne County Prosecutor Kim Worthy filed charges that reflected the full scope of what investigators believed had occurred: first-degree premeditated murder, felony murder, carjacking, armed robbery, felon in possession of a firearm, 5 counts of felony firearm. 10 charges in total, built on the evidence collected from the parking lot, the vehicle, the trail across 3 jurisdictions, and the testimony of witnesses who had seen a figure in a blonde wig in the vicinity of Detroit Receiving that morning. 10 charges. And yet, in a development that generated significant public reaction, Miller ultimately pleaded guilty to a single-count, second-degree murder, as part of a plea agreement. The first-degree murder and felony murder counts were dismissed. The carjacking, armed robbery, felon in possession, and 5 felony firearm charges were dismissed alongside them. What remained was 1 count, carrying a sentence of 35 to 60 years in the Michigan Department of Corrections. The family's reaction to the plea agreement was not uniform silence. They showed up to the sentencing hearing, and they spoke with a force and a grief and a directness that courtrooms rarely hear at the volume it was delivered that day. The sentencing hearing lasted 45 minutes. There were tears throughout, and there was one moment when Wilson's grandmother, Pamela Galston, approached the microphone that seemed to pull every person in that room into complete attention. She was not interested in measured language. She was not performing grief for the benefit of the cameras. She looked at Jamere Miller and she said, with the full authority of a woman who had buried her granddaughter because of the man sitting in front of her, "What kind of person are you? Where do you come from? Who can even support you right now? The hurt you have caused my family you don't deserve. You need life in prison." And then she said, "You ain't fit to live." 5 words, delivered in a courtroom in Detroit, Michigan, by a grandmother who had watched her granddaughter leave for a hospital shift and never come home. 5 words that no legal proceeding, no plea agreement, no sentencing guideline can fully address or absorb. Miller's attorney read a letter from his client at the sentencing hearing, and the contents of that letter introduce one of the most psychologically complex elements of this entire case. Miller wrote that he thinks about the morning he killed Patrice Wilson constantly. He wrote about her last moments specifically, that she tried to tell him how to stop the bleeding, that even as she was dying at his hands in a car he had taken control of, Patrice Wilson was trying to help herself survive. She was a nurse. Even in those final moments, she reached for the training and the instinct that had defined her professional life. She tried to stop the bleeding, and she told him how. Miller wrote that it has been the worst, most haunting experience of his life. He wrote that Patrice didn't deserve what happened. He wrote that they didn't deserve to lose both their lives over this. He wrote that he failed her, that he failed them, that he was ashamed. That letter deserves to be read carefully, because it contains something that forensic psychologists who work with intimate partner homicide offenders recognize immediately. The framing of "we both lost our lives," the positioning of the perpetrator as a co-victim of the event, is a well-documented cognitive pattern in offenders who have committed acts they cannot integrate with their self-image. It is not necessarily calculated. It may be genuine, in the limited sense that the person writing it believes it to be true, but it is a reframe that absorbs the harm done to the actual victim into a shared tragedy, rather than a one-directional act of violence against a woman who was trying to live her life. Patrice Wilson did not lose her life because of a shared tragedy. She lost her life because a man put on a wig, drove to her workplace, and shot her. The judge, Kevin Cox, said he echoed the sentiments of everyone who had spoken that day. He called the murder senseless and violent. He noted that there were people in that courtroom who believed Miller deserved life without the possibility of parole. And then he said something that carries a specific weight given Miller's age at the time of sentencing. Given your age and the length of this sentence, there is a good chance that life without parole will, in fact, be what this becomes. Miller was formally sentenced to 35 to 60 years. He will be in his 70s, at the earliest, before he is eligible for release. There is a reasonable possibility that he will die in prison. And there is a family in Detroit that has spent every day since Mother's Day weekend 2023 trying to understand why someone who had done everything right still ended up in the trunk of her own car. Now we have to go back 12 years, because Patrice Wilson is not the only woman whose story intersects with Jamere Miller's name, and the case that predates hers, the case that was quietly reopened the moment Miller's arrest made the news, is one of the most chilling dimensions of this entire story, and one that has never been fully resolved. Bianca Green was 24 years old in March of 2011. She went by BB. She was a nursing student at Wayne County Community College, a detail that is not incidental, and she worked at a restaurant at Detroit Metropolitan Airport. She lived in Romulus, Michigan, approximately 30 minutes outside Detroit. She had a young son, Jamere Jr., who was a toddler at the time. She was 6 to 8 weeks pregnant. And she had a prior relationship with a man named Jamere Miller. On March 25, 2011, Bianca Green was last seen at her workplace in Inkster. She texted her mother 2 days later, and then nothing. No credit card activity, no contact with family, no sightings that were ever confirmed. She left her car behind, her clothes, her apartment, her toddler son. Her family said from the beginning that this was completely out of character, that Bianca Green would never have left Jamere Jr., that there was no version of this story in which she chose to disappear. Her family always suspected foul play, and they always had a name in mind. But without a body, without physical evidence, without enough to clear the threshold required for charges, the case went cold. Jamere Miller was questioned. He was not charged. In a detail that will make your skin crawl, Miller actually appeared at a Crime Stoppers press conference in 2012, a year after Bianca's disappearance, holding his toddler son, appealing publicly for information about the mother of his child. He stood in front of cameras and said it was hard being a single father, and that it was hard to tell his son what was going on with his mother. And Bianca's young son, coached by his grandmother, looked into those cameras and said the words that no child should ever have to say, "Mommy, we miss you. We want you to come home. We want God to bring you home." A man who investigators would later connect to the murder of another woman stood in front of cameras, holding the child of the woman who may also have been his victim, and asked the public for help finding her. Bianca Green has never been found. When Jamere Miller was arrested in May of 2023 for the murder of Patrice Wilson, the Bianca Green case did not stay buried. Her family surfaced immediately. Her uncle Keith Green told reporters it was a lot to stomach, that they had never given up hope and had tried to give Miller the benefit of the doubt. But the arrest of a man with a history of violence against women, in connection with the murder of another woman who was also trying to leave him, made the benefit of the doubt impossible to sustain. Detroit Police Chief James White confirmed at a press conference that investigators were now working with Romulus Police to determine whether Miller had any connection to Green's disappearance, that the two cases shared enough structural similarity. The victim was a woman connected to Miller. The victim was someone Miller had reason to want to control or silence. The victim disappeared under circumstances that pointed toward foul play, that investigators could no longer treat them as unrelated. The pattern, once you see it, is impossible to unsee. Bianca Green was studying to be a nurse. Patrice Wilson was a nurse. Both were women who had a child with Miller. Both were women who were, at some point, trying to create distance from him. One disappeared in 2011, pregnant, leaving a toddler behind. The other was found in the trunk of her car on Mother's Day weekend, 2023, shot multiple times by a man in a disguise. The 12 years between those two events were not years of reform or reflection for Jamere Miller. They were years in which he continued accumulating criminal charges, continued demonstrating a pattern of behavior that law enforcement and courts processed one charge at a time without ever assembling the full picture. As of the time Miller was sentenced for the murder of Patrice Wilson, he had not been charged in connection with Bianca Green's disappearance. The case remains open. She remains missing. Her family remains without answers. And the man who may hold those answers is now serving 35 to 60 years in a Michigan correctional facility, which means he is alive, he is accessible to investigators, and the possibility of accountability for what happened to Bianca Green has not expired. It is simply waiting. There is a concept in the study of predatory intimate partner violence called the escalation continuum, the documented pattern by which controlling behavior intensifies over time, moving through stages of psychological coercion, isolation, harassment, and surveillance before arriving, in the most extreme cases, at physical violence. What makes that continuum particularly dangerous in cases like this one is that each stage can look, from the outside, like a version of something normal. A man who sends flowers to a woman who has ended their relationship can be read as romantic or obsessive, depending entirely on the framework through which it is viewed. A man who shows up uninvited can be read as devoted or threatening. A man who won't accept the end of a relationship can be read as heartbroken or dangerous. The framework that determines which reading is correct is almost always the history. And Jamere Miller's history, the criminal record, the assault charges, the weapons charges, the prior relationship with a woman who disappeared under suspicious circumstances, constituted a framework that should have generated a different level of institutional response than it apparently received. Patrice Wilson was trying to leave a man who had assault charges on his record, who had a missing ex-girlfriend, who had a pattern of behavior that her own mother could describe in detail, the flowers, the things left at the door, the refusal to accept her decision. That pattern was visible. It was known to the people around her, and it was not sufficient within the systems available to her to produce the kind of intervention that might have changed the outcome. This is not an indictment of any specific agency or officer. It is a recognition that the systems designed to protect people from intimate partner violence, restraining orders, protective orders, welfare checks, risk assessment protocols, are imperfect instruments applied to situations that evolve faster than bureaucracies can track. And the result, in case after case, in city after city, is that women who have done everything they were told to do still end up as the subject of a press conference, rather than the beneficiary of one. Patrice Wilson's coworker Nicole Rice started a GoFundMe in the days following her death. She wrote that Patrice may be gone from this earth, but her legendary memory will forever live on in their minds and in their hearts. The fundraiser was intended to cover funeral costs and establish a college fund for Wilson's son. That detail, the college fund for a 7-year-old boy whose mother was killed before she could see what he would become, is the kind of detail that recalibrates everything. Behind every statistic about intimate partner homicide is a child who grew up without a parent, a family that reorganized itself around an absence, a grandmother who said you ain't fit to live in a courtroom because no other language felt adequate to the size of what had been taken. Wilson's uncle, Jeff Moore, said her absence has left an irreplaceable void. Her death shattered the family, that they will never fully understand why, and that not understanding why is something that will haunt them forever. Because one of the particular cruelties of intimate partner homicide, as opposed to crimes committed by strangers, is that the person who could explain it is known, is alive, is sitting in a courtroom. And yet the explanation they offer, the letter about failing her, about them both losing their lives, about shame, never quite reaches the depth of the wound, never quite answers the question that the family is actually asking, which is not why did you do it, but why did you think you had the right? That question, why did you think you had the right, is the one that sits at the center of every case of intimate partner violence that ends in death. It is the question that no courtroom fully addresses, because courtrooms deal in charge, end evidence and sentencing guidelines. It is the question that communities have to answer for themselves, slowly and imperfectly, through the accumulation of cases like this one and the willingness to look at what connects them. Jamere Miller is in prison. He will be there, barring extraordinary circumstances, for the rest of his functional life. The justice system has processed what it could prove within the framework available to it and produced a result that is, by any measure, more accountability than many victims of intimate partner homicide ever see their perpetrators face. And yet, Bianca Green is still missing. Her son is now a teenager, growing up without a mother, carrying questions that may never be answered. The Romulus Police Department continues to hold an open case. Tips are still being accepted. The investigation, such as it is, continues. And every year that passes without a resolution is another year that a family lives in the specific, grinding uncertainty of not knowing where she is, not knowing what happened, not knowing whether the man now sitting in a Michigan correctional facility holds the answer that would allow them to finally, incompletely, grieve. If you have any information related to the disappearance of Bianca Chanel Green, last seen on March 25, 2011, in Romulus, Michigan, you are asked to contact the Romulus Police Department at 734-940-18400 or Crime Stoppers of Michigan at 1-800-SPEAK-UP, where anonymous tips are accepted, and cash rewards of up to $5,000 are available. Some cases are about one crime, and then some cases are about a pattern, about the way a certain kind of person moves through the world, leaving damage behind them, operating just inside the threshold of what can be proven until the day they cross it so dramatically that the full weight of the law finally lands. The story of Jamere Miller and Patrice Wilson is the second kind of case. It is not just about a parking lot in Detroit on a Saturday morning in May. It is about 12 years of behavior. About a woman named Bianca who studied nursing and vanished while pregnant. About flowers left on a doorstep and returned, untouched. About a blonde wig purchased and worn, and used to close the distance between a parking lot and a woman who had run out of legal tools to keep that distance in place. And it is about Patrice Wilson, 29 years old, a nurse, a mother who tried, who held the line, who returned the flowers and refused the calls and did everything the advice columns and the hotlines and the well-meaning people around her said to do, and who still, on a Saturday morning before Mother's Day, found herself in a parking lot with a man she thought she had left behind. She was not a cautionary tale. She was a person. She was legendary to the people who worked beside her, irreplaceable to the family who loved her, and everything to a 7-year-old boy who needed her to come home. If you or someone you know is in a relationship that carries any of the warning signs we have described in this video, the refusal to accept no, the escalating contact, the history of violence, the sense that leaving might make things worse, please reach out to the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. It is free, confidential, available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, by call, by text, and by online chat at the hotline.org. There are people there who understand exactly how complicated this is, and exactly how much courage it takes to make that call. Subscribe to Behind the Evidence if you are not already here. Share this video, not for the algorithm, but for the person in your life who might need to see that the most dangerous moment in a relationship is the moment you try to leave, and that danger is real and documented and survivable if the right support is in place before it reaches the parking lot. Patrice Wilson's name should be spoken. Her son should know that people who never met his mother understand what was lost when she was taken. And Bianca Green's name should be spoken too, because she is still out there somewhere, waiting to be found. And her family is still waiting. Behind the evidence there is always more. We are always going to find it.